To his neighbors in suburban New Jersey, he was a large, quiet family man. A husband and father who mowed his lawn and took his children on outings. He was also, by the time the law caught up with him, a contract killer. What sets his case apart is not the double life, which is common enough in these stories, but a single forensic idea he tried to exploit, and the way it betrayed him. He attempted to defeat the one clue he most feared, the time of death, by freezing a body. The ice is what gave him away. He operated in and around organized crime, taking on killings for money and for the settling of others' scores. That world is, by design, hard to investigate. The victims are often criminals themselves. The motives are hidden, and the people who might testify have every reason to stay silent. A contract killer leaves fewer of the usual threads than a compulsive one. No relationship to the victim, no obvious motive, no pattern rooted in personal need. For a long time, that professional distance kept him beyond the reach of any single case. Every killer who thinks carefully worries about the same thing: linkage, how a body ties back to them. And one of the most dangerous facts a body can reveal is when the person died. The time of death anchors everything. It tells investigators who had opportunity, and it can shatter an alibi in an instant. If a suspect can prove he was elsewhere at the time a victim died, he walks. So this killer fixed on a chilling idea. If he could control what the body said about when it died, he could control the whole investigation. His method was as cold as his nickname would become. After a killing, rather than dispose of the body promptly, which would let a pathologist estimate the time of death from the state of decomposition. He froze it and kept it in cold storage. Later, sometimes long after, he would put the body out to be found. Pathologist examining it would estimate a time of death based on its condition and be badly misled. The freezing had, in effect, stopped the biological clock. The timeline would point to the wrong day entirely. In one case, a man had gone missing and was not seen for a long stretch of time. A period measured not in days, but in far longer. Eventually, his body was discovered. On the face of it, a body found after so long should be heavily decomposed, offering only a rough and helpful timeline. But when this body was examined, something was wrong. Its condition did not match a person who had been dead for that entire missing period. It was, for the time involved, far too well preserved. Here is the detail that unraveled his method. When the pathologist examined the tissue, there was evidence consistent with the body having been frozen, including signs in the accounts of the case of ice having formed within it. That single observation flipped the whole puzzle. The body was not the record of a recent death after a long disappearance. It was the record of a killing that had happened much earlier, with the body kept frozen in the interval. The freezing meant to hide the time of death had instead announced itself. This is the science he did not account for. Freezing a body is not invisible. When tissue freezes, water inside the cells forms ice crystals that rupture cell structures in a characteristic way, and the overall pattern of preservation does not match natural decomposition. A trained pathologist can recognize the difference between a body that has decomposed slowly in the ground and one that has been held in a freezer. His clever trick worked only until it met an examiner who knew what frozen tissue looks like, and then it did the opposite of what he intended. The detail of the freezing gave the case its enduring identity. When his methods became known, the press seized on the image, and he became known as the Iceman. Nicknames like that can distort a case, turning a criminal investigation into a piece of folklore. But beneath the sensational label was a genuinely instructive point. He had tried to weaponize the limits of forensic timing. and had been undone by the very science he underestimated. The nickname stuck because the method was, in its cold way, memorable. For all that a frozen body suggested foul play and a particular kind of offender, suspicion is not a conviction. Investigators came to believe he was responsible for killings, but proving a specific murder against a careful contract killer, with reluctant witnesses and a criminal underworld unwilling to talk, is extraordinarily hard. They needed more than forensic suspicion about old bodies. They needed him, in effect, to incriminate himself. And for that, the authorities turned to one of the most demanding techniques in law enforcement: a long-term undercover operation. A multi-agency task force devised a patient, dangerous plan. An undercover agent would pose as a fellow criminal, someone plausibly in the same trade, and work his way into the suspect's confidence over many months. The goal was not a dramatic confrontation, but something slower and surer. To get the suspect, in his own words, on tape, discussing and agreeing to criminal acts. It required an operative willing to spend a long time earning the trust of a man believed to be an experienced killer, with all the personal risk that implied. The undercover work stretched over a long period. The agent met with the suspect repeatedly, talked his language, and slowly became, in the suspect's eyes, a trusted associate. This is the unglamorous reality behind the dramatic idea of a sting. Not a single clever trap, but months of careful, nerve-wracking relationship building, in which one wrong word could blow the operation, or worse. Each meeting was an opportunity to draw the suspect a little further into speaking openly about the work he did, while the recorders ran. The operation gathered what the old bodies alone never could: the suspect's own voice, describing and agreeing to criminal acts. In the course of the recorded dealings, plans were discussed that included killing a target using poison. Captured on tape, in his own words, agreeing to such acts with a man he believed was a fellow criminal. The suspect provided the direct, first-person evidence that reluctant witnesses and old forensic puzzles could never supply. The undercover work had turned suspicion into a case he could not talk his way out of. The recorded discussions of using poison were especially damning, because they showed not a man reminiscing vaguely about the past, but one actively planning a killing in the present, with a supposed partner. This is the value of the undercover approach against a careful offender. It does not depend on reconstructing a cold, contaminated scene from years earlier. It captures the offender committing himself, in real time, to a crime, leaving no room for the argument that the evidence was circumstantial or the timeline mistaken. With the recorded evidence in hand, the task force moved and arrested him. The quiet suburban family man was taken into custody, and the long, patient investigation, the forensic suspicion raised by a frozen body, and the months of undercover work converged into a single moment. The man who had tried so hard to control what the evidence said about him was now confronted with the one thing he could not freeze, edit, or explain away: his own recorded words agreeing to kill. With a suspect in custody and a strong case built on the recordings, investigators could revisit the earlier killings with new understanding. The frozen body that had first hinted at his method now fit into a fuller picture. What had once been an inexplicable forensic anomaly, a body too well preserved for its missing time, became a comprehensible piece of a contract killer's tradecraft. The science that had first raised the alarm helped tie the historical crimes to the man the undercover operation had finally caught. At trial, the combination proved formidable. The forensic evidence, including the frozen body findings and above all the undercover recordings in which he had incriminated himself. The defense faced the near impossible task of explaining away a man's own recorded words. The layered case, physical evidence pointing to method, and direct evidence of intent and agreement, left little room. It was a demonstration of how modern investigations often work. Not one silver bullet, but several independent kinds of evidence, reinforcing one another. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to terms that ensured he would never be free again. He would spend the rest of his life in prison and die there. The suburban double life was over, and the contract killer who had tried to outtit the forensic clock was contained for good. But the case had a strange afterlife, because the man himself would not stop talking, and what he said in the years that followed has to be treated with real caution. In prison, he gave interviews in which he claimed an enormous number of killings and told vivid, elaborate stories about his methods. These accounts made him famous, but investigators and researchers have long regarded many of his claims as exaggerated or unverifiable. The self-mythologizing of a man who enjoyed the attention. It is an important caution for any true crime story. The most colorful version of a case is often the least reliable. What can be trusted is what the evidence supports, not what the offender chose to boast. Strip away the myth, and the enduring lesson is the forensic one. Time of death is one of the most powerful facts a body can yield, and he understood that well enough to attack it by freezing a body to scramble the timeline. What he failed to understand is that freezing is not invisible to a trained examiner. He tried to erase a clue and instead created a new one. The case is taught as a reminder that tampering with evidence tends to leave its own distinctive fingerprint. The lesson is that cleverness aimed at the evidence often backfires. A more careless killer simply have dumped the body and left an honest, if damning, timeline. By freezing it, he introduced an anomaly that a sharp pathologist could read like a signature. Combined with the patient, unglamorous work of a long undercover operation, that single cold detail helped end him. The evidence he worked hardest to control became the evidence that spoke most clearly against him. If you want more case files like this one, the real cases, and the single detail that finally cracked them, consider subscribing to the channel. Every episode looks calmly at how a crime was solved, without sensationalism and without swallowing a killer's own legend. The Iceman case is a lesson in how tampering leaves traces and how patient undercover work can catch what forensics alone not. Thanks for watching.